Hello everyone, welcome back to our channel. In today's video, I'm going to walk you through the process of setting up the Spring Auth2 Authorization Server. The Auth2 Authorization Server is one of the major applications that is involved in the Auth2 authentication standard, and it is the application that is responsible for managing the users and for issuing token as well as validating them. Now, the Spring team has been working very hard over the last years to come up with this amazing project that simplify the process of building your own application, your own authorization server, and maintaining it in a really springy fashion. So the team has recently released the starter of this project, and it is available on the start.spring.io website, and that starter is amazingly interesting. We're going to be using that today to build our authorization server, and I'll show you how to configure every bit of it. It's so simple, you're going to love it. And if you are interested in this type of content, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel and smash the like button on this video. So before we start coding, I want to show you this small schema that highlights the various parts of the OAuth2 protocol. And basically there are three major applications that comes together and make up this protocol. So we have basically the OAuth2 authorization server, the OAuth2 client server, and the resource server. So they perform different functionalities, right? The authorization server is responsible for holding all the user information, login details, and stuff like that, and it's responsible for giving out tokens and verifying and validating them as well. And the client here is responsible for basically performing actions on behalf of the user. So the resource server are basically the resources, that is the thing you're trying to protect, so they're always locked down. All right, now when a user wants to get access to their resource, for example this resource right here, they will need to firstly get an authorization token that they will present to this guy, telling them that they want to have access to this resource. But the way it is done normally is by going through another application, which is the client application, which is known by this authorization server. So this client application will make the request to the authorization server using its own credentials that has been set up on the authorization server, and the authorization server, depending on the type of authentication scheme they're using, whether it's OAuth to the authorization code flow or the client credential flow, will require the user to provide their credential, and then most likely also a consent, some type of consent, accepting that they agree for this application to have access to their information. So when this user then confirm with the authorization server will return an authorization code to the client, and with that authorization code the client can then ask for an access token. So given the access token, when the OAuth2 authorization server returns the access token to the client will use that access token to make requests to the OAuth2 resource server for the specific resource. Now, the resource server will then receive that token, it will analyze it, and try to verify the signature. So there are one of two ways it does this. It can either call another endpoint that the authorization server exposes to verify the token that it received, or it could have access to the public key of the key pair that was used to sign the token presented from this OAuth authorization server to the client, and use it to validate the authenticity of the token. But both ways work fine. So now when this guy verify that the token is valid, it will then fetch the resource. Before you do that, it also make sure that the permissions or the rules on this token is enough to gain access to the specific resource that they are demanding. So when all these checks are passed, it will return the resource, and then the OF2 client can serve it back to the user. So basically, this is the rough overview of this flow. There are lots of articles and videos online about this entire process, but what we'll be focusing on into this video mainly is the OF2 authorization server from Spring, and is the new one, of course. There are lots of authorization servers out there. There's Keycloak, there's the one from Amazon Cognito, there's the other one from how do you call them? There's Up Zero. There are a lot of them. So the one we'll be focusing on is the authorization server from Spring, and I'm going to show you all about configuring it and setting it up in your project. So we'll also take some look at these ones as well, so that we can bring the entire idea together and see it in action. But this is going to be the star of the show, so we'll focus more on this authorization server and how to configure it. Now if you're excited for this video, smash that like button and let's start coding. Right, so I will head out to the famous start.spring.io website, and here I'm going to configure the authorization server. And first I'll set up my group ID io.undev var, and by the way, we're using Java and Spring Boot version 3.1.1 and Java version 17. So I'll just put in this metadata, and I'll call this artifact as of server, and then the description I'll just say Spring Authorization Server. Now this is okay for the metadata, and the most important part is the dependencies section. So here I'm going to add the dependency that we need to work with the Spring Authorization Server, and that dependency is the OAuth2 authorization server. So this was not part of this start to Spring our website before, but now it has been added there. So we have a starter, which is really great and helpful. So I'm going to just select that, and basically that's all we need to get our authorization server started and working. So I'm going to download this project and then load it up in IntelliJ. So see you there. Okay, so now that we have bring in our application in IntelliJ, I'm going to start the configuration process for setting up the authorization server. So now the first thing we'll do is to go down to the main package here. We'll have the Java and resources. I will scroll down in the resources folder, and then this one is where we're going to configure it. There are two ways of configuring this. You can configure it using Java classes by defining bins in component classes or configuration classes, but using the DSL, as they call it, is much more convenient. So with Spring Boot, you just define these configuration properties here, and then the Spring Boot auto configuration will automatically set up those beans for you in the background, so you don't need to define them yourself. So we'll go with that approach. Okay, so the first thing I would like to set up here is the port of this application. So for that, we will do it like so. Say server.port, like so, and then we'll set the port to 9000. Okay, now next thing is to set up some other Spring related configuration, like the application name. So I'll set the application name, and I will just call this one the authorization server. Okay, awesome. Now the most important thing to configure here for the authorization server is the security. Okay, so we already have in our dependency section the dependency that we need to work with Spring Authorization Server. So this is the dependency, the starter, and then with this in our class path, we can go ahead and configure it like so. So we'll configure security and OAuth2 and the authorization server. So you see how my ID is helping me to just bring it in order. So cool, right? All right. Now the next thing we need to configure after writing this authorization server is the client. Okay. So we'll write client, and here is where we define our client. So we're gonna call our client demo client, and demo client, we need to provide some registration information for this demo client. So for that, we'll write the word registration, and in the registration section, we'll provide a few information about the client. So the first one we'll provide is the client ID, this one, and we're gonna call it just demo client. The next one is the client secret, the client secret. So this client secret we need to encode. So for this, we'll use the no up password encoder, and we just got it. This secret can be, it should be something really secure. So we're gonna just say our top secret, something like this. But you get the idea. It should be something secure, so you can even bring in a base64 encoded value and put it there. So we just use this for now. And next thing is the next, after configuring the client secret, we need to also configure the client authentication methods. So the client authentication methods basically is the way the client applications will prove to the authorization server who they are by providing their authentication, just like a user will authenticate to a system. So to do that, we have to specify the method that we use for that. So the client authentication method, and there are a few, there are I think 3 or 4 methods, but the one we will go with is the client secret basic. So the client secret basic means that we provide the client information, as a basic authentication. Okay, so we'll go to client secret. It should be underscores client secret basic, this one, and you can see here is a list, so you can provide multiple values there. So this is a list, and after setting the client authentication methods, we also need to set the authorization grant types. So the authorization grant types are, the like the OAuth2 strategy that you use. So you can use the authorization code flow, like your like that is like you have the user to provide their information, and then based on that information they will receive an authorization code, and then with the authorization code the client application can then send that code along with some other information to get a token. So we need to configure something like that as well. So we'll just set the authorization grant types, and we can put many here as well, because this is a list. So we'll put the first one, which is the authorization code, and I'll add another one, which is the client credentials. Okay, so there's also the um, refresh token, this one. So you can add them in this order. So for now, this is good. And then the next thing we can configure is, for example, if you're using the authorization code, for your application, you need to provide redirect URIs, and then that redirect URI is where the authorization code will be sent, and then based on how you configure that application that will receive that authorization code, it will then use it to demand for a token. So in our first, in our demo here, we will not be going with the authorization code. We'll be using the client credentials, but you can have them in a list so that it is also available as option. So it is not really required to pass in the redirect URIs if you are not going to be using the authorization code. So since we already have it here, let's just configure that as well. So we'll configure the redirect URIs, and then the first URI we use is we just put http // I'll just put some website, just put start. So this one should be https. I'll just put the start.spring.io website, and here after that we need to put login, and then we need to put o of 2 and /, and then we need to put in the client ID. Okay, so the client ID in this case is demo client. All right, so now with this setup, we can now go ahead and configure a few more things. So we now have the redirect URIs. Okay, now we need to add the scopes. Okay, so the scopes is like basically how much, it's like kind of like rules, but the scopes tell you to what extent the token that will be generated, can impact the system, to what extent, something like that. So there are a few scopes. You put the scope stuff first. So there are a few scopes. One is the OpenID scope. So if you're using OpenID Connect, you can use this scope. By the way, it's a list as well, so it should be like so. And then you can pass in as many scope as you desire in your application. You can pass in a scope for maybe API dot read, something like this, and you can pass in other scope, API dot write, and you can pass in as many scope as you required within your application. So now that we configure the scopes, we kind of like basically done in a sense to with everything we need to run this application as an authorization server. Now the next thing we need to do is to configure the users. Okay, so the actual users in the system, that is the resource owners. So our application server, authorization server is set up. So now when I try to run it, it should start with no problems. Let's hope that works. And we have some problems. So let's see what went wrong. Just check this. So it is at this point we have a problem with the configuration there. This we should put in quotation like so, and that should fix it. Let's test it again. Awesome. So now you can see that our application started correctly, and we already know Spring Security by default will give us this generated password to test our application, because Spring Security tend to lock down all of your application by default. So the next thing I want us to do is to set up some users in the application, and the way we're going to do that is we will use we'll create a bin of type user details service, and then we'll return an in-memory user. So for that, I'll come in this Java package, and inside of it I've already created a package called config, and in this config I'll create a file called I'll just call it app config. Okay, and then we just annotate it with app configuration, and inside of this class I'll define a bin. This bin will be of type user detail service. So it's going to be a public user detail service, and I'll just call it user detail service, like so. Let me try to import this. Okay, and here I'll return a new in-memory user detail, in memory user details manager, this one, and inside of this one is where I'll pass in a user that I will create. So I'm gonna create a user, and we'll use the with default password, and then pass the information of this user. Okay, so we'll just do that. We'll do username, and for this I'll just put test at ondevvar.io. It should be in quotation, and the next thing I'll set up is the password, and for the password I'll just put password, and the next thing to set up is some rules, and I'll just give it a rule of user, and after that we build this, and that should be it. So return this as a new this thing. So this will be our user. So normally you connect your database and then find your users there and return them. But since we're just using this demo thing, we'll just use the in-memory manager to get us this user that we pass it here by default. So this is the username and this is the password. Okay, so I'm going to save, restart the application, and hope everything works fine. Awesome. So now our application is started correctly on port 9000 as we configure. The next thing I want us to do is to test this authorization server using Postman, and let's see if we can obtain an access token. Okay, so to test the application to get a token, firstly we need to know which endpoint to call, right? So when you look at the OAuth2 specification, there's the well-known endpoints that gives you all the other endpoints that you should be familiar with. So in the case of our application, when you visit I'm using, by the way, HTTP to call this endpoint. So our application port is, when you see this colon 9000, it means localhost 9000, and this is the endpoint that when you call, it will give you some information about your authorization server. So when I run this, and you can see here I have all the endpoints that I can call within my application, that I can call to obtain some information about from the authorization server. So here I have the endpoint for authorize if you're using the authorization grant, and you have endpoint here for device authorization. You also have the endpoint for token introspection. You have a lot of endpoints here, but the one we are concerned with is this one, the token endpoint. So to get the token, you need to pass in these information. So we'll use Postman to test this and see if we can get a token. Also, there's this JWK endpoint here. This one is used to get the public keys, the location of the public keys that we use to sign this the token that will be given when you call this token endpoint. So let's try to get our token now. Okay, so now that we have set up our authorization server and it is running, we've also went ahead and looked at the well-known token endpoints, and we saw the list of endpoints that we can call to get a token and authorize with the authorization server. Let's now try to get the token using the client credentials flow. Okay, so if you look at our configuration here, we have in our authorization grant types, we have authorization code, we have client credentials, and we have refresh token. So we'll test firstly with these client credentials, and after we try to test with the authorization code. Okay. So with the client credentials, all we need to do is to provide a basic of authorization. By the way, we're using Postman. So provide in your client ID and then your client secret, which will be like the username and password. So with this two credentials, your client, which in this case is Postman, will be able to authenticate with the authorization server. And once it's done that, in the body section here of the request that will be sent to this endpoint, we will pass in XWW form your encoded data, and the data will contain the grant type that we will use, and in our case we're using the client credentials grant type, and also we need to pass in the scope. So for now you can pass in as many scopes as you wish, but I'll just stick it to the OpenID. All right, now let's test this. So I'm going to send this endpoint, and hopefully we should get a token, and voila, we have a token. So this is our token, and with this token now we can go ahead and test. We can call any resource server that is secured and is set up to validate against our authorization server that we set up. So you see here we have our access token, we have the scope, we have the token type, which is bearer, and we also have the expiry date. So this expiry date is where you can customize it using the DSL, so you can customize it in your application, the YAML file as well if you want to. Now this is our token, and we have a working authorization server. So next, let's try to test it using the authorization code flow, which involve the user, typing in their password and getting an authorization code and using the authorization code to demand a token. Unlike this one that we just directly, got the token, the authorization code flow is a bit another step is involved. So let's look at that now. Okay, so now that we've seen how to get the token using the client credentials flow, let's now try to get a token using the authorization code flow. So with the authorization code flow, you need to firstly send a request to the authorize endpoint. So you will send it to the OAuth2/authorize endpoint with some parameters. All right. The easiest way I tend to do it in Postman is I try to build the URL and then copy it to the browser. So to build the URL, we need to set up a few parameters, and the parameters are these. We need to firstly set up the response code, the response type rather, and the response type will be code because when we call this authorize endpoint, we will be expecting a code coming back to us. So you pass in the response type, which is code, and then the scope, which is your scopes that you configure within your application, your authorization server, and then you need to pass in the client ID as well as the redirect URI. So the redirect URI is the endpoint that will receive the token, the authorization code when it's when there's a successful login procedure. So when the username and password of the user is submitted correctly, they will be redirected to this URI, and along with they'll be redirected to the URI along with the authorization code. So the URI here is configured also within our application. So this is the redirect URI. You can place in as many as you want, and then your application you can use them to redirect. And also the other one where we saw the scopes, we have a bunch of scopes here. So in this case, I'm using just the API.read scope. All right. So this endpoint I won't call in Postman because it requires the browser. So it's going to return to me a web page, and I cannot visualize a web page unfortunately in Postman. So I have to copy this endpoint that we've set up. I'll just copy it like so and then take it into the browser, and in the browser I'm just going to start a new tab and paste it in like so. So when I run this, I'm presented with the famous Spring Security login. So here I need to log in, and you might ask, where am I going to get the username and the password to log in? Remember, in our application we set up an app config, And in this app config, we define our user detail service with an in-memory user. So this is where you will configure your application normally to go and find users within your database and and authenticate them basically. But since we are just doing a simple demo, I've created just one user, which is an in-memory user. See this in-memory user details manager, and I've set it up with the following credentials: test at undervar.io, and password is just password, and then I give him a role of user. So this is the user credential that we're going to use to authenticate in the app. Back to the browser, I'm going to type in that password now, test at undervar.io, and the password is just password. Now, before I type in the correct information, let's just pretend to send in bad information. So I'll just add 1 2 and send it. You'll see that we're sending bad credential. We cannot log in. So now let's put in the good credentials. So this one is the username and the password is just password. And when I sign in, I am redirected. By the way, don't worry about this error. This is true because this website, start.spring.io, doesn't have any route that matches the thing that was set up. So I just put it there for testing purposes. But what is important is this code that we receive back. So our application, our authorization server now went ahead and checked, validated the user is proper, and then authenticated them. It then created this code and then sent it back as part of the redirect, as part of the response to this redirect URL that we set up. So this is the code that we're going to use to request for an access token. Okay, so I'm going to copy this code. Try my best to copy it all, and I'll just press Command C and copy it. So now that I've copied this thing correctly, this code that we received from our authorization server, I'm going to move to Postman, and in Postman I have set up this endpoint, which is the token endpoint. Remember, the first one was the authorized endpoint. We went there to authorize to get the authorization code. Now that we have the authorization code, we come now to the token endpoint to request for an access token. So we will need to configure now a post request, and this post request will have these parameters, these query parameters here: grant type, code, and the redirect URI. And the redirect URI should be exactly the same as the one that was sent when requesting the token. Okay, so when requesting the authorization code, not the token. So now that we have that code, I'm going to paste it here, and the grant type, of course, is the authorization code grant type that we have configured in our authorization server. And also we need to authenticate our client as well. So to do that, we'll come here as usual, the basic auth, and then we'll pass in our client ID and the client secret. So now our authentication is set up and our parameters are all looking good. Let's now see if when we send this request, we'll get a token. So I'm going to click on send, and voila, we have our token. So this is the authorization code flow. So this is our token that we receive, and we also got a refresh token as well. See that? So we use the refresh token to get a new token when this access token is expired. Awesome. So now we've seen the two popular ways to get access token from your authorization server. It could be any authorization, so it could be Okta or Keycloak or even Amazon Cognito or any other authorization server provider on the market. This is the Spring Authorization Server project, and then we've configured it correctly just by using the application.yaml file. It's so simple, and you don't need to worry about any other thing. It just works. Spring Boot auto configuration takes care of creating all the beans for you. You just need to specify your configurations and everything will work out fine. So to make this more interesting, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a resource server with some resources. So we'll have a few endpoints, and then we'll secure those endpoints and try to access those endpoints using the token that we get from our authorization server. So let's try to do that now. So you already know how we do it. we come over to the start the Spring AI website to set up a new service or project basically. So now to set up our resource server, I'm just going to quickly configure one, and as usual our group ID is io.ondev, and I'm just going to call this one resource server. Okay, and then I'll just call it describe it as our protected resource server basically. All right, and now yeah, that's all we need for this section. We'll set up Java as Java 17 and Spring 3.1.1, which is okay. Now let's add the dependencies, the most important part. So we're going to be building a web service, so we'll add the Spring Web dependency, and we will be securing this web dependency Spring this web service with Spring Security OAuth2. So we need the OAuth2 resource server security project. So we'll say resource OAuth2 resource server. Okay, so this dependency will lock down this entire web application that we build, or web service, however you call it, no problem. I'm not gonna add any other dependency because I'm just gonna be returning a basic hello world string, and yeah, that's it. But you can add as many dependencies as you wish. You can add your Spring Data JDBC or Spring Data JPA. You can add your Postgres. You can add your Lombok, your, you know what I mean, all the good stuff to build your web service. So what I'm going to focus on is just securing this web service such that we cannot access it unless we provide a valid token that was generated or acquired from our authorization server that we set up previously. So now I'm going to download this project and bring it in IntelliJ. See you there. All right, now we are here in IntelliJ. I've charged up our resource server application that was set up previously. Now, just to save everybody some couple of minutes, I went ahead and configured this thing really quick. It's so simple, you'll be shocked. Now, in the resource folder, in the main folder here, inside of the resources folder as well, I've changed this thing from application.properties to YAML, and all that I've done in here so far is just set up the port for this resource server application, because it is in fact a separate application running on its own process, so it needs to have its own port. And then I just give it a name like always. I call this one resource server, and this is all the configuration we need. This is the bare minimum configuration that we need to set up our resource server to validate token against our authorization server. So basically we just say security OAuth2 resource server, and then the token that we're working with is a JWT type token. So we'll specify that here, and then we give the address of the authorization server. So that's this issuer URI, and this you can find from the well-known endpoints. You'll see the issuer URI there, so I just got it from there and put it right here. So just like this, our application here is totally secure by Spring, not Spring Security, by Spring Security, and it is gonna be validating token against our authorization server. So that means if a request comes in with a token, it's gonna grab that token and then validate the signature against this authorization server, because why not? He gave it. So if this guy say I don't know that token, then it's gonna block that token and say you cannot access this resource that you want. But if this guy approves that yeah, this token is in fact coming from me, then we'll let the guy go through. So that's it right there. So the other thing I did is I just set up in the Java package, I just created one class and made it a REST controller class. So set up the request mapping to /test, and like I said, just returning a simple hello world string here. You see that? We're just returning hello from security resource server. So if your application, if your request comes in with a valid token, you'll have access to this endpoint, but if not, you'll be denied. That is the default Spring security behavior. It locks everything down, and it is up to you, the developer, to open some endpoints if you so desire. So I'm going to start this application and head out to Postman to do some tests. So it is in fact started correctly. So now let's go to Postman. All right, so now we are in Postman, and inside Postman I've set up this endpoint, which is a get endpoint, and we are going to our authorization, not our authorization, but our resource server rather, and calling this resource slash test. This resource should return to us a string saying hello, from resource server, something like that. And now I'm gonna send this request without providing any type of authentication. So if you come to authorization here, you see no authentication, is like no security, nothing. We're just sending it clearly like that. So let's see the reaction. I send it and we get a 401 unauthorized error. What does this mean? It means that we are not authenticated. We don't have right to access that resource. Okay, so the way to get access to that resource is by sending in a request along with a valid token. So we are not seeing any type of messages here because exceptions and other things has not been configured. We're just using the bare minimum, like just how easy it is to get started, just to showcase that to you. Now, the way we can get our token, we saw it before, is by either using one of the grant types, the flows in the OAuth2 specification thing. So you can either get by using the client credential grant, which I configure in one of my endpoints here, this one. So you can access a token directly by providing the client credential grant, the scope, and also providing the client ID and the secret as basic of. So when I send this request to our authorization server, we'll have a token. So now if I copy this token, I'll just command C and copy this token and come back to our resource here and change this authorization, which is set to no off. I will change it to bearer token because the token provided by our authorization server is of the bearer type. Okay, it's using the bearer scheme. So we should use that here as well, bearer token, and I'm gonna paste in this box the token. So now when I send this request, we have a problem here. For one, probably the token has an issue. Let's try that again. I will come back to my this thing and send a request. I didn't copy the token correctly, probably that was the error. So now let's copy all of the characters in the token. So I'm copying this and come back to this endpoint, copy everything here, backspace, and paste a new one and send the request. Awesome, now it's working. So before, you see we sent a token that was not good, so it did not give us the resource, instead gave us a 401. Now you see that we pass in the correct token. We have our hello from secure resource server. Awesome in it. So now this is how simple is it to secure your application using OAuth2. And the Spring Authorization Server project just made it even more easier to have your own authorization server set up in your own environment, and you can manage it. So you don't need to worry about your data leaving your system, going to third-party systems. So you can control everything, and the Spring Authorization Server will help you with that OAuth2 authorization server facility. So yeah, this is it, and thank you so much for watching. If you have any question about this flow and anything you didn't understand, leave it in the comment and I'll try my best to answer you. See you next time. Bye bye.